The induction cooktop hummed at a low, nearly imperceptible frequency, a steady vibration that Vivian felt more in her jaw than in her ears. On the white marble counter, the digital kettle clicked. 195 degrees, exactly. Vivian did not rush. She measured 3 grams of loose-leaf Iron Goddess oolong into a small clay teapot. The dry leaves sounded like tiny, desiccated fingernails scraping against the clay. She poured the water, watching the steam rise in a thin, twisting ribbon that dissolved into the cool, conditioned air of her 24th-floor apartment. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city below was a muted gray smudge of twilight and early November drizzle. Down there, people were rushing, horns were blaring, and the damp chill was soaking through cheap coats. Up here, it was silent. It had taken 10 years of 60-hour work weeks, missed meals, and absolute, crushing isolation to buy this silence. Then, the marble counter vibrated. The phone didn't ring. Vivian had disabled the ringer years ago. Instead, the heavy glass and metal device let out a dull, rhythmic buzz against the stone. Mom. Vivian stared at the glowing screen. Her thumb hovered over the glass. In her mind, the metabolic calculator began to run. To answer, 40 minutes of circular guilt, Helen's wet, shallow breathing, and the inevitable pivot to money. To decline, 4 more consecutive calls, a string of increasingly urgent text messages, followed by a text from her brother Leo, accusing her of being cold-hearted while their parents suffered. The energy required to endure the subsequent siege was greater than the energy required to absorb the impact now. She picked up on the 4th vibration. She did not say hello. She simply pressed the phone to her ear and waited. Vivian? Helen's voice was thin, frayed at the edges, and instantly accompanied by a familiar background track. The squeak of rubber-soled shoes on wet linoleum, the distant, metallic chime of a hospital public address system, the low, rumbling cough of a man in a nearby plastic chair. "I'm here, Mom," Vivian said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the bright, artificial warmth she used with her clients. It was a voice stripped of all unnecessary weight. "It's your father," Helen said. She paused, letting the silence hang, waiting for Vivian to gasp, to ask what happened, to offer a frantic stream of reassurance. Vivian did none of those things. She slowly poured the first steep of the oolong into a tiny porcelain cup. The amber liquid was perfectly clear. She waited. When the silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, Helen let out a sharp, wet sniff. He collapsed at the kitchen table this morning, just fell right forward into his oatmeal. Leo had to carry him to the car. We've been in the emergency room at St. Jude's since noon. What did the triage doctor say? Vivian asked. His kidneys, Helen whimpered. They're failing, Vivian. They say he needs to go into acute dialysis immediately, and then there's the matter of his heart. The valve we thought was fine. They're saying it's leaking. He needs a specialist. But they won't transfer him to the private wing at Mercy without a deposit. Vivian took a sip of the tea. It was hot enough to scald the tip of her tongue, a sharp, localized pain that she welcomed. Why does he need the private wing? Because the ward here is terrible. Helen's voice rose, a sudden sharp spike of indignation that quickly smoothed back down into a victimized tremble. There's a man in the bed next to him who keeps shouting, "Your father can't rest. You know how fragile his nerves are." Leo's been on the phone with the administration for 3 hours trying to negotiate, but they're so heartless. He's practically making himself sick with worry. He hasn't eaten all day. There it was, the first mention of the golden son. Leo, who was 32 and lived in Helen's basement. Negotiating meant he had likely complained to a nurse, gotten defensive when asked for an insurance card, and was now sitting in the hospital lobby playing games on his phone while Helen bought him vending machine snacks. "Did Leo offer to co-sign the admission deposit?" Vivian asked, her voice entirely neutral. A brief, heavy pause on the line. Vivian could hear the distant rustle of a paper tissue as Helen wiped her nose. "Vivian, don't start," Helen whispered, her tone shifting to that familiar, warning sharpness. "You know Leo's situation. He's between contracts right now. He's sacrificed so much of his own career just to stay close to us and help around the house. He's doing the physical work. He's the one who lifted your father off the floor." The physical work. Vivian looked down at her left wrist. A faint, pale scar ran across the joint, the result of a compound fracture she had sustained at 17 when she fell off the roof trying to clean the gutters because Leo had refused to get off the couch. She had walked herself to the clinic. She had paid the $50 copay with cash she earned paper-clipping documents at a local real estate office. "How much is the transfer deposit?" Vivian asked. "They want $12,000, Helen said. She delivered the number quickly, almost casually, as if it were a minor inconvenience, a chore Vivian had forgotten to do. "And then the specialist is out of network. The hospital billing lady said we need to show proof of at least $40,000 in escrow before they'll schedule the valve procedure for Tuesday." $52,000. Vivian stared at the steam rising from her cup. 18 months ago, Helen had undergone a complex spinal reconstruction. The surgeon had demanded $35,000 up front. Vivian had wired the money directly to the clinic within 2 hours of the call. She had skipped 3 days of work to fly down, sitting in the hard plastic chairs of the recovery room, breathing in the smell of rubbing alcohol and stale cafeteria coffee, while Leo slept at home. 6 months later, at Thanksgiving, a dinner Vivian was invited to only after she volunteered to pay for the catering, she had sat at the far end of the table. She had watched Helen reach across the basket of rolls to take Leo's hand, her eyes shining with tears. "I don't know what I would have done without my boy," Helen had told the assembled aunts and cousins. "When the hospital demanded that money, Leo didn't hesitate. He took out a personal loan, put his own future on the line, just to make sure his mother could walk again. He's our angel." Leo had smiled, a modest, sheepish grin, and squeezed Helen's hand. He hadn't corrected her, neither had Helen. Vivian had sat there, her fork hovering over a plate of cold turkey, feeling the weight of the $35,000 she had pulled from her own investment account. Money that had never been repaid. Money that had never even been acknowledged. She hadn't said a word. She had simply chewed her food, swallowed, and left before dessert. "Vivian, are you still there?" Helen's voice was tighter now, the polite mask slipping. "I know it's a lot, but this is your father's life. Surely your job... you're always traveling. You live in that expensive place. You can spare this. We're family." "I have to check the liquid assets in my holding account," Vivian said quietly. "Well, don't take too long," Helen said, her tone reverting to a fretful sigh. "The doctor said if we don't have the deposit by tomorrow morning, they'll have to keep him in the general ward, and the noise is just killing him. Leo is doing everything he can, but we need the financial side handled." "I understand," Vivian said. "Call me back as soon as the transfer is done. Use the direct wire code I texted you last year." Helen didn't wait for an answer. The line went dead with a dry electronic click. Vivian lowered the phone. She did not set it down. She held it in her hand, feeling the warmth of her own palm transferring to the cold glass. She looked at her tea. It had grown lukewarm. A thin, dark ring had formed around the inner rim of the porcelain. With a slow, deliberate movement, Vivian poured the cold tea into the sink. She watched it spiral down the drain, disappearing into the dark plumbing of the building. She did not cry. She did not feel the sudden, hot surge of anger that used to choke her when she was younger. Instead, she felt a profound, heavy stillness. She walked over to her desk, opened her laptop, and logged into her primary banking portal. She stared at the balance. It was more than enough. It was always more than enough. But as her fingers hovered over the keyboard, she didn't open the wire transfer tab. Instead, she opened a blank spreadsheet. She began to type. Arthur's medical deposit, $52,000. Helen's spinal surgery, unpaid, $35,000. Leo's business loan, 2024, $15,000. Property tax lien on the family home, 2023, $8,400. The list went on. A ledger of invisible labor, a record of a tap that had been left running for so long the people drinking from it had forgotten it had a handle. Vivian leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet room. Outside, the rain began to hit the glass with a steady, rhythmic hiss. The green digits on the microwave read 11:42 p.m. The silence in the apartment was absolute, save for the rhythmic, dry clack, clack, clack of a small, hand-carved walnut clock sitting on the high shelf above the refrigerator. It was the only object Vivian had taken with her the night she was kicked out at 18. Her grandmother had slipped it into her duffel bag while her father was downstairs screaming about her unfilial selfishness because she refused to sign over her college savings account so Leo could buy a used silver pickup truck. The wood of the clock was scratched near the brass latch, a permanent reminder of a hasty exit. Vivian stood at the kitchen island, a gray microfiber cloth in her hand. Spraying the white marble with a mixture of lavender and white vinegar, she began to wipe. She worked in slow, concentric circles. She pressed her weight into her heel, leaning over the counter to ensure every microscopic smear of water, every faint fingerprint near the edge, was polished away. Her physical routine was a form of grounding. In her world, if she controlled the physical space, the chaos of her childhood could not seep through the floorboards. She wiped the surface until the marble was cold, sterile, and perfectly reflective under the low-hanging pendant lights. The phone on the counter buzzed twice, short, aggressive vibrations that caused the metal frame to slide a fraction of an inch across the polished stone. Leo. Viv. Mom is losing her mind. Did you send the $12,000 yet? St. Jude's billing office opens at 8. We need to move him before the morning shift change. Let us know when it's done. Vivian did not pick up the phone. She folded the microfiber cloth into a neat square, matching the corners perfectly, and hung it over the neck of the sink faucet. She walked over to her desk. The blue light of her laptop screen cast long, pale shadows across the minimalist room, reflecting off the dark glass of the balcony door. On the screen was her personal wealth management dashboard. She ran an internal calculation. To transfer $12,000 immediately would take approximately 45 seconds. It represented roughly 1.8% of her current liquid cash reserves. It would require no sacrifice on her part, no missed payments, no adjustments to her lifestyle. But the psychological cost, the surrender of her agency to a family that viewed her success as a public utility, was a debt she was no longer willing to service. Every time she had paid in the past, she had bought herself a temporary truce. A few weeks of polite texts from Helen, a brief period where Leo didn't passive-aggressively post on social media about people who forget where they came from. But the truces were getting shorter, and the demands were getting larger. She sat down, her fingers resting lightly on the cold aluminum edge of the keyboard. She opened the messaging app on her laptop, syncing it to her phone. She typed, "I need the hospital's itemized pre-admission estimate and the written insurance denial before I can release the funds from the holding trust." She hit send. The response was almost instantaneous. The bubble danced on the screen for 3 seconds, disappeared, then came back. "Leo, what holding trust? Just Venmo it or do a direct transfer like you did for Mom's back. We don't have time for paperwork, Viv. Dad is sick." Vivian read the words. She could hear Leo's voice in them, the petulant whine, the subtle irritation that she was not instantly complying with his instructions. She knew exactly what he was doing. Sitting in the hospital waiting room, his boots dirtying the linoleum, feeling superior because he was the one physically there, while she was just the bank. She typed back, "The financial structure of my accounts has changed. All major disbursements now require third-party verification for tax compliance. I need the itemized estimate and the insurance denial. Once I have those, the trustees will review the request within 48 hours. It was a lie, of course. There were no trustees. There was only Vivian, her laptop, and her cold, deliberate decision to erect a wall of bureaucratic friction between herself and her family. In the past, she had been a water tap. She wanted them to realize that the water now had to pass through a series of heavy, rusted valves. The phone began to vibrate. "Mom." Vivian didn't answer. She let the phone slide across the marble counter as it buzzed, the sound echoing in the quiet kitchen. It rang for a full minute before dropping to voicemail. 3 seconds later, a text arrived from Helen. "Helen, Vivian, what is this? We are at the hospital. We don't have printer paper or emails. Just send the money. Why are you making this difficult? Your father is in pain." Vivian stared at the text. She remembered when she was 19, working 3 jobs, living in a basement apartment with damp walls, and a landlord who yelled through the floorboards. She had asked Helen for $50 to buy groceries after her car alternator died. Helen had told her, "We aren't a bank, Vivian. You wanted to be independent, so be independent. Leo needs his tuition topped off this month anyway." Now, the shoe was on the other foot, but the family script remained unchanged. To them, her independence was a crime when she used it to protect herself, but a blessing when they needed to exploit it. She didn't reply to Helen. Instead, she stood up, walked to the kitchen, and opened the refrigerator. The cool, yellow light spilled across her face. Inside, everything was organized, fresh, and expensive. Organic vegetables, imported cheeses, high-quality proteins. She took out a small bottle of mineral water, twisted the cap, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold water shocked her throat, clearing the lingering taste of the lukewarm oolong tea. Behind her, the phone buzzed again. "Leo. Mom is crying. Thanks a lot, Viv. Great timing." Vivian closed the refrigerator door. The kitchen returned to its dim, twilight state, illuminated only by the faint blue glow from her desk and the green digits on the microwave. 11:54 p.m. She walked to her bedroom, leaving the phone on the kitchen island. She did not take it with her. She did not want to hear it vibrate against the nightstand. As she pulled the heavy linen sheets over herself, the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of her grandmother's walnut clock drifted through the open door, a steady, unyielding beat in the dark. For the first time in years, the sound didn't make her feel lonely. It made her feel solid. The silence of the night settled over her like a heavy, protective blanket, while 60 miles away, in a brightly lit hospital waiting room, the first cracks of confusion and irritation were beginning to form. The morning light did not so much rise as bleed into the apartment, a slow, watery transition from charcoal to cold lavender. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving a heavy fog that clung to the upper floors of the surrounding glass towers, slicing them off from the earth. At 6:15 a.m., Vivian's alarm went off. It was a single, soft chime from a small brass clock on her dresser. She sat up immediately, her movements fluid and practiced, honed by years of waking up before the rest of the world so she could secure her head start. She walked into the kitchen. Her bare feet made no sound on the wide plank oak floors. The apartment was cold. She kept the thermostat at 66 degrees at night, preferring the sharp, clean wakefulness of the chill over the stuffy warmth her parents had always favored in their drafty, oil-heated house. In the kitchen, she began her morning routine. She took a manual ceramic burr coffee grinder from the cupboard. It was made of dark wood and cast iron, heavy and cool to the touch. She weighed exactly 18 grams of light roast Ethiopian beans on a digital scale. The beans were small, hard, and smelled of dried berries and earth. She poured them into the hopper and began to turn the crank. The physical resistance of the beans was satisfying. Crunch, crunch, crunch. She felt the vibrations travel up her wrist, through her forearm, a steady mechanical feedback. She did not rush. She turned the handle at a constant pace, her eyes fixed on the gray fog pressing against the window. It took a full 2 minutes to grind the beans to a fine, uniform sand. As she poured the kettle of 94-degree water over the grounds in a slow, circular motion, the rich, woody aroma bloomed into the air, filling the clean kitchen. It was the only scent in the room. Only after her first sip of the black coffee did Vivian walk over to the kitchen island and pick up her phone. The screen lit up, displaying a wall of notifications. 2 missed calls, Helen, 2:14 a.m., 4:45 a.m. 1 missed call, Leo, 3:08 a.m. 3 unread messages. Vivian leaned against the counter, holding the warm mug in her left hand while her right thumb scrolled through the log. She did not feel her pulse quicken. Years of market volatility and high-stakes corporate restructuring had trained her body to treat panic as a wasteful expenditure of glucose. She opened the messages. Leo, 3:10 a.m. Unbelievable. Dad is shivering in this hallway because they won't give him a blanket without his admission processed. Thanks for nothing, Viv. Really showing your true colors tonight. Helen, 4:48 a.m. Vivian, please. Your brother is exhausted. He's been up all night trying to help your father. We just need the code to transfer the deposit. I don't understand this talk about a trust. You've always just paid before. Is something wrong with your money? Please call me. Helen, 6:02 a.m. Good morning, sweetie. I know you're probably busy with your meetings, but please help us. Leo is so stressed he's having stomach issues. Just do what you can. I'm sure your trustees will understand it's an emergency for your dad. Vivian analyzed the progression. The middle-of-the-night texts were designed to trigger panic, the mention of the cold hallway, the shivering, the heavy-handed guilt. Then, as dawn approached, Helen had transitioned to her secondary tactic. The soft, wheedling tone, the diminutive sweetie, paired with the subtle jab about Vivian's meetings, as if her professional life were merely a self-indulgent hobby that kept her from her real duty. And finally, the weaponized incompetence. I don't understand this talk about a trust. Helen understood perfectly well what a trust was. She had watched enough daytime television to know. What she actually meant was, I refuse to engage with any system that I cannot manipulate through emotional leverage. Vivian took another sip of coffee. She calculated the energy cost of a phone call. If she called, Helen would weep. Leo would take the phone and shout, his voice cracking with the performative rage he used to mask his own uselessness. They would talk over her, interrupt her, and ignore any logical explanation. She sat at the island, pulled the phone closer, and typed her reply. Vivian, good morning. To begin the verification process for the disbursement, please have Leo scan the hospital's itemized pre-admission estimate and the formal insurance denial. He can download a free scanning app like Adobe Scan on his phone. The files must be sent as PDFs. Once I upload them to the portal, the review will begin. She did not add, I hope Dad is okay. She did not offer to call. She did not explain why the trust existed. She simply laid out the tracks. If they wanted the train to move, they had to lay down the rails. She hit send and set the phone face down on the marble. She returned to her coffee. It was cooling now, the complex fruit notes of the bean becoming more pronounced. She took her time, savoring the quiet of her kitchen, the clean lines of her furniture, the lack of clutter. Exactly 8 minutes later, the phone buzzed. Leo, I'm not downloading some stupid app. I don't have space on my phone anyway. We're in a hospital, Viv, not an office building. Just send the money. Stop playing games. Vivian stared at the text. Stop playing games. It was Leo's favorite phrase whenever he was asked to perform a task that required more than 5 seconds of effort. In his mind, any structure, any boundary, any expectation of personal responsibility was a game designed to humiliate him. Vivian did not argue. She did not explain that a PDF took less than a megabyte of data. She did not point out that he had plenty of storage space for his mobile gaming apps. She copied her previous text, pasted it into the chat window, deleted the greeting, and added a single sentence at the bottom. The trustees cannot initiate the review without the PDF scans. Let me know when they are ready. She sent it. Instantly, her phone began to ring. It was Helen. Vivian watched the screen slide across the counter with each vibration. Ring, ring, ring. She did not pick it up. She let it ring out. 10 seconds later, it began to ring again. Leo. She picked up the phone, tapped the side button to silence the ringer, and set it back down, face down. The screen continued to flash silently against the dark wood of the island, a small, frantic distress beacon that she chose to ignore. She stood up, took her empty mug to the sink and rinsed it. The water was hot, steam rising to fog her reflection in the stainless steel basin. She dried the mug with a clean linen towel, placed it back on its shelf, and walked toward her bedroom to get dressed for the day. Behind her, the silent screen kept flashing, but the silence in the apartment remained unbroken. By 9:30 a.m., the corporate headquarters of Miller & Vance was operating with its usual quiet, expensive efficiency. The office occupied the top 3 floors of a granite-faced tower downtown. Here, the air tasted slightly of ozone from the heavy-duty laser printers and the dry, filtered chill of the central climate control. Vivian sat at her desk, which was a single, seamless slab of frosted glass suspended by brushed steel anchors. She wore a tailored charcoal gray wool blazer, the fabric fine and cool against her skin. Before opening her first spreadsheet of the morning, she performed her daily workspace setup. It was a silent, meditative sequence. First, she positioned her black leather desk blotter exactly parallel to the edge of the glass. Next, she placed her heavy, brass-capped fountain pen to the right of the blotter, the clip pointing precisely north. Finally, she opened her physical planner, a leather-bound book with heavy, cream-colored pages that smelled faintly of cedar and glue. She smoothed the page down with the side of her hand, enjoying the dry, crisp sound of the paper. To anyone looking through the glass walls of her office, she appeared entirely focused on her market analysis. On the corner of the frosted glass, her phone lit up without a sound. A new notification appeared. Transcription of voicemail. Helen, 10:14 a.m. Vivian did not play the audio. She had long since learned that listening to Helen's voice, the shaky, carefully calibrated tremors, the sudden, sharp inhalations meant to convey physical distress, weakened her resolve. The sound of her mother's voice bypassed Vivian's intellect and went straight to the old, raw pathways of her childhood, where she was still the girl who slept on a deflated air mattress in the laundry room because Leo needed her bedroom for his home gym. Instead, she read the automated transcription on her computer screen. The raw, unformatted text, stripped of vocal dramatics, was revealing in its nakedness. "Vivian, we called your office company number, but the woman at the front said they couldn't transfer us to your personal desk without an emergency protocol. I told her it was an emergency, but she said she couldn't. Leo went through the old blue folder in the basement and found your old tax papers from 3 years ago. We called the number on the W-2, but it's not active anymore. Why did you change your number without telling us? We tried to call the bank name on the paper too, but they said they don't have a trust under your name. Vivian, please. The billing lady here is asking for the card number. She said if we don't pay the $12,000 by noon, they have to discharge your father to the county clinic in South Heights. Leo is so angry he's pacing. Why are you doing this to us? Just give us the card number." Vivian stared at the screen, her hand resting on her heavy brass pen. The sheer, intrusive desperation of it was staggering, yet entirely predictable. They had gone into the basement. They had dug through her old cardboard boxes, through the private papers she had left behind when she was forced out, with nothing but a single duffel bag. They had found her old tax documents. They had tried to call her employer's general line, and then they had actually attempted to call her private bank to bypass her entirely and access her money. They had not called to ask how she was. They had not called to explain the medical situation in more detail. They had called to find a way to reach into her pocket without her permission. A cold, analytical calm settled over Vivian. The metabolic calculator in her mind began to run the numbers. St. Jude's Hospital was a county facility. They would not discharge Arthur to a county clinic in South Heights for a failing heart valve. Emergency rooms were legally bound to stabilize patients. What Helen was actually describing was the hospital refusing to transfer him to the premium, private cardiac wing at Mercy Hospital, the one with the quiet rooms, the view of the park, and the specialized surgeon who didn't take state insurance. They wanted the luxury care. They wanted the prestige. And they wanted Vivian to pay for it while Leo took the credit for organizing it. She calculated the depth of their financial decay. Arthur's basic pension was small. Helen's Social Security was mostly spent on Leo's car insurance and the interest on 3 different credit cards. Over the last 5 years, Leo had drained $80,000 of equity from their home to fund 3 separate businesses: a drop-shipping website that sold cheap massage guns, a junk removal franchise that went bankrupt in 6 months, and a crypto trading account that had evaporated during the last market correction. They had 0 savings. They had no credit left. They were living on the edge of a cliff, and they had spent years assuming Vivian was the safety net that would always catch them. She reached for her phone. She did not call Helen. Instead, she dialed a direct, secure line she kept in her contacts. "Private Client Advisory, this is Marcus." A quiet, professional voice answered on the second ring. "Marcus, this is Vivian," she said, her voice dropping to a low, calm murmur that didn't carry past her office door. "I need to place a high-security alert on all my personal and corporate accounts, effective immediately." "Of course, Vivian. What's the nature of the security protocol?" "There is a possibility of unauthorized access attempts by family members," Vivian said. She did not hesitate. She did not feel shame. "They may have access to older tax documents, my social security number, and previous residential addresses. I want to implement a multi-factor voice and token authentication for any verbal or written transaction. No wires, no drafts, and no account inquiries without my physical key. Understood, Marcus said, the sound of keyboard clicks quiet in the background. I'm locking down the profiles now. We will also flag any incoming calls matching the names on your emergency contact list from your old files. Is there anyone specific we should watch for? Helen, Vivian said, and Leo. If either of them calls pretending to be my representative or claiming a medical emergency on my behalf, deny access and log the call. It's done, Vivian. You're completely insulated. Thank you, Marcus. She hung up the phone. She felt a slight physical release in her shoulders, the tiny mechanical click of a lock turning. She had officially cut off the back door. If they wanted her money, they would have to face her directly through the narrow, difficult path she had built. They would have to do the work. She looked back at her planner. The ink on the page was dry. She picked up her brass pen, aligned her thoughts, and began to analyze the third-quarter financial reports for her midday meeting, leaving the small, silent screen of her phone to flash in the corner of her glass desk, completely powerless. At 1:10 p.m., Vivian walked down to the building's private outdoor courtyard. The air was crisp, carryover wind from the river whistling through the gaps in the granite facade. The courtyard was minimalist, raw concrete benches, gray gravel beds, and a single row of ornamental bamboo that rustled with a dry, paper-like sound in the breeze. She sat on a cold concrete bench, her back perfectly straight. From her leather tote, she extracted her lunch container. It was a matte black ceramic bento box with a thick silicone band. Vivian prepared her own meals every Sunday night, a quiet 3-hour ritual of chopping, steaming, and portioning. Today's lunch was simple: a portion of cold, black forbidden rice, a strip of pale, flaked salmon, and thin slices of pickled cucumber. She unfastened the silicone band, the snap of the elastic clean in the open air. She separated her cedar chopsticks, the wood splitting with a neat, dry splinter. She began to eat. Each bite was deliberate, chewed exactly 15 times before swallowing. She didn't read her emails. She didn't look at her portfolio. She focused entirely on the texture of the rice, the sharp, vinegary crunch of the cucumber, and the cool wind on her face. This was her space. She had paid for it in sweat, and she would not allow the shadow of her family to darken it. At 1:25 p.m., she finished her meal. She wiped the cedar chopsticks with a small paper napkin, placed them back inside the box, and snapped the silicone band back into place. Only then did she pull her phone from her pocket. There were 4 new text messages from Leo, sent in a rapid 3-minute burst starting at 1:12 p.m. The first 3 messages were attachments. Vivian tapped them to open. They were not PDFs. They were low-resolution, poorly lit photographs. The first image was a shot of a hospital intake form, crumpled and laying on what appeared to be the greasy, gray-speckled laminate of a hospital waiting room table. Leo had taken the photo with his camera's automatic flash turned on, resulting in a blinding, white-hot orb of light directly in the center of the document, completely obliterating the itemized cost section. The second image was heavily blurred, as if he had swung his arm while pressing the shutter button. The shaky lines of text looked like a swarm of insects crawling across the page. The third image showed a corner of the insurance denial letter, but Leo's dirty, short-nailed thumb was pressed firmly over the section detailing the reason for the rejection, hiding the critical codes. The fourth message was text. Leo, there, I did your stupid scanning. It took me 20 minutes because the hospital Wi-Fi is garbage. Now send the $12,000. The billing lady says she's leaving for her lunch shift at 2, And if it's not cleared by then, she's putting a hold on the specialist. Don't start with your corporate bureaucrat crap, Viv. This is Dad we're talking about. Vivian zoomed in on the first image. The white flash reflected off the paper, but she could see the trembling blue ballpoint ink of her father's signature at the bottom. The metabolic calculator in her mind processed the situation in less than a second. This was a classic maneuver from Leo's playbook. It was the weaponized incompetence he had used his entire life to escape effort. When asked to clean the garage as a teenager, he would throw 3 boxes into a corner, break a rake, and declare the job impossible so Vivian would be forced to finish it. He knew how to take a clear photo. He was 32 years old and spent half his day posting crisp, high-definition videos of customized trucks on his social media accounts. He had deliberately sent garbage because he wanted to test her boundary. He wanted to see if she would do the labor of decoding his mess, or if she would simply fold under the pressure of the 2 p.m. deadline and wire the money to make the problem go away. If she accepted these unreadable files, she would be signaling that her rules were hollow. She would be inviting a lifetime of blurry photos, half-finished tasks, and chaotic last-minute emergencies. She tapped her screen and typed, "Vivian, these are photographs, not PDFs. The first image has flash glare that makes the figures illegible. The second image is too blurred to read. The third is cut off. The Trust's automated document portal will reject these instantly. Please use the scanning app. It adjusts the contrast and flattens the document automatically. I need clear, readable PDFs of the full pages." She hit send. The response was so fast it felt like a physical blow. "Leo, are you serious? Dad is literally sitting here in a wheelchair. His feet are swollen. And you're playing hall monitor. What is wrong with you? Do you think you're better than us because you have money? Just transfer it." Vivian watched the screen. She felt nothing but a cool, detached curiosity. It was like watching a cornered animal throw itself against the bars of a cage it didn't realize was locked. A minute later, a text from Helen came through. "Helen, Vivian, sweetie, please. Your brother is trying his best. You know he's not good with technology. He's been running around all morning. If we lose this specialist appointment, I don't know what we'll do. Can't you just call the billing office and give them your card over the phone? They said they can take a verbal authorization if you sign a waiver later. Please, for your father." Vivian did not blink. The billing office would indeed take a card over the phone, but doing so would bypass the trustee system she had just established. It would prove to them that the system was a fiction, a temporary excuse she had fabricated because she was having a bad day. It would invite them to push harder next time. She stood up from the concrete bench, her bento box held securely under her arm. She typed a final reply, addressed to both of them in their separate threads. "Vivian, I cannot bypass the portal. The trustees require the documentation in the correct format for tax auditing. Let me know when the scanned PDFs are ready. I am going into a 3-hour client meeting now and will not be reachable." She set her phone to Do Not Disturb, allowing only her bank's security department and her direct reports at Miller & Vance to bypass the filter. She walked back toward the heavy glass doors of the tower. As she entered the lobby, she could hear the distant, muffled chime of the city transit train below, a steady, mechanical heartbeat. The first phase of her withdrawal was complete. She had introduced friction into their lives, and for the first time in 10 years, they were realizing that her wealth was not a natural resource they could harvest with a scream or a tear. It was a locked vault, and she was the only one who held the key. By 4:45 p.m., the sky beyond the frosted glass of Vivian's office had bruised to a deep, heavy plum. The afternoon rain had returned, dragging a damp chill against the triple-paned windows. Below, the city was a crawling river of red taillights thousands of people trapped in the slow, wet crawl of the evening commute. Vivian stood at her desk, her knuckles resting lightly on the cool, frosted glass. She had just returned from her 3-hour client meeting. Her voice felt slightly dry from presenting a complex debt restructuring model to a panel of skeptical hedge fund managers. She had won them over, not with passion or grand gestures, but with the cold, unassailable weight of her data. She began her routine of wrapping up the workday. She clicked the power icon on her dual monitors, watching the bright financial grids collapse into black glass. She slid her slim, leather-bound laptop into its designated sleeve inside her structured black tote bag. Each zipper was closed with a slow, steady pull, the metal teeth interlocking with a dry, satisfying shk. She placed her brass fountain pen back into its velvet-lined drawer, turned the small key in the lock, and slid the key into her pocket. Only after her desk was completely bare did she retrieve her phone from her blazer. She turned off the Do Not Disturb mode. The screen lit up with a barrage of notifications, but among the text alerts from Helen and Leo, there was a new, unexpected email notification from an external domain, c.vargas@stjudeshealth.org. Subject: Documents for Arthur Vance / patient ID 88204-A. Vivian sat back down in her ergonomic leather chair, the high-grade hide creaking softly under her weight. She opened the email. Dear Ms. Vance, my name is Clara Vargas, and I am a patient advocate and medical social worker here at St. Jude's County Hospital. Your mother, Helen, and your brother, Leo, approached my desk this afternoon regarding a transfer deposit for your father, Arthur Vance. They indicated that your family's private trust office requires formal, itemized documentation before funds can be disbursed. To assist them, I have personally scanned and attached the official pre-admission estimate for the Mercy Private Pavilion transfer, as well as the signed out-of-network liability waiver and the primary insurance determination letter. Please let me know if your trustees require any additional verification to process this request. We are hoping to secure the transfer bed by tomorrow morning. Sincerely, Clara Vargas, LCSW Patient Advocacy Department, St. Jude's Hospital. Vivian stared at the screen. A faint, cold smile touched the corners of her lips, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The boundary had held. Because Vivian had refused to engage with Leo's weaponized incompetence, because she had ignored the frantic phone calls and the blurry, illegible photos, they had been forced to seek professional help. Leo, too proud to download a free app on his phone, had been forced to stand in front of a social worker's desk, holding his papers, and ask a stranger to do the work for him. He had been forced to admit, through his actions, that Vivian's rules were real. Vivian clicked on the first PDF attachment, pre-admission_estimate_mercy_pavilion.pdf. The document was crisp, high contrast, and perfectly aligned. No glare, no shadow of a dirty thumb. She began to calculate. Her eyes skipped past the alarmist, red-stamped, due up front figures and went straight to the itemized ledger. The total cost of the valve replacement and the 5-day stay at the Mercy Private Pavilion was estimated at $114,000. But as Vivian scrolled down to the insurance breakdown, she noticed something her family had conveniently left out of their panicked, late-night narratives. Arthur's primary Medicare policy and his private secondary supplement did cover the valve replacement. They covered 80% of the surgery itself and 100% of a standard ward stay at St. Jude's County Hospital, the hospital where he currently lay. The $52,000 deposit they were demanding from Vivian was entirely due to a single elective choice: the transfer to the Mercy Private Pavilion, an out-of-network luxury facility, and the selection of an out-of-network chief surgeon. Vivian opened the second attachment. signed _liability _waiver.pdf. At the bottom of the page was her father's shaky signature, and right below it, as a witness, was Leo's bold, childish scrawl. She understood the play instantly. Leo didn't want his father in a county ward because it wounded his own pride. Leo wanted to be able to tell his friends, his cousins, and the neighbors that he had got his father into the prestigious Mercy Pavilion, treated by the city's top private surgeon. He had signed the waiver, committing his parents to a massive financial liability they could never pay, fully expecting that Vivian would quietly write the check to cover his vanity. The physical anchor of her office, the dry, ozone-scented air, the heavy silence of the 24th floor kept her grounded. She did not feel anger. She felt only the cold, hard satisfaction of a chess player who had just seen her opponent's predictable opening move. She clicked reply to Clara Vargas, adding Helen and Leo's email addresses to the carbon copy field. She typed, "Dear Ms. Vargas, thank you for providing the clear, itemized documentation. I have successfully uploaded the pre-admission estimate and the liability waiver to our trust management portal. The trustees have initiated the standard compliance and medical necessity review. Under our current trust bylaws, elective out-of-network transfers require a 48-hour evaluation period to determine if comparable in-network care is available at the current facility. St. Jude's is a fully accredited cardiac center, so the trustees must review why the transfer to Mercy is medically indicated rather than elective. The estimated completion time for this review is Friday at 5 p.m. I will update you as soon as the trustees issue their determination. Best regards, Vivian Vance." She hit send. The email vanished into the ether. Vivian closed her laptop, slid it into her bag, and stood up. She pulled on her black wool coat, wrapping the collar tightly around her neck. By setting the deadline to Friday evening, she had bought herself exactly 48 hours of absolute silence. She had officially taken the steering wheel out of Leo's hands. For the next 2 days, they would have to sit in the noisy, crowded ward of the county hospital, listening to the beep of monitors and the shouting of other patients, realizing that their vanity had a price and that Vivian was no longer willing to pay it on demand. The windshield wipers swept across the glass in a rhythmic, rubbery beat, shuck, 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 clearing the greasy city rain in clean, fan-shaped arcs. Inside the cabin of Vivian's sedan, the only sound was the low, muted thrum of the tires against the wet asphalt of the expressway and the steady, metallic ticking of her turn signal as she prepared to take the exit. Vivian drove with both hands on the leather-wrapped steering wheel, her grip light but precise. The green glow of the dashboard instruments cast a soft, calm light over her face. She kept the cabin temperature set to a cool 68 degrees, the air vent blowing a faint, dry stream against her collarbone. She took the ramp down into the subterranean parking garage of her building. The transition from the rainy, dark evening to the harsh, fluorescent glare of the concrete garage was instant. The air down here smelled of cold stone, damp tires, and the faint, sweet scent of exhaust. Her tires let out a sharp, rubbery squeal on the painted green concrete as she maneuvered into her private bay, positioned directly next to one of the thick, structural pillars. She shifted the car into park. She did not turn off the engine immediately. She sat in the idling vehicle, her hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the soft mechanical purr of the engine and the distant, hollow echo of another car door slamming 3 levels above. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and opened her email app. As she expected, the carbon-copied thread with Clara Vargas, the social worker, had already received 2 replies. The first was from Leo, sent at 5:12 p.m., barely 27 minutes after Vivian's email. Because he was replying to a thread that included a hospital professional, his usual unvarnished rage had been forced into a tight, clumsy jacket of faux administrative jargon. Leo, this is completely unnecessary. My father has already signed the liability waiver. St. Jude's is a public facility and does not have the specialized post-operative recovery units that Mercy offers. The delays from your trust office are putting his health at risk. We need this review expedited. Every hour we wait in this observation unit is dangerous. Vivian's eyes scanned the words without a single flicker of emotion. She knew exactly what Leo was trying to do. He was trying to use the social worker as a weapon to bully Vivian's trustees. He was painting St. Jude's, the very hospital they were currently standing in, as a dangerous, subpar holding pen, hoping the social worker would agree and pressure the trust to move faster. But he had made a critical mistake. He had insulted the very institution Clara Vargas worked for. Vivian scrolled down to the second reply, sent at 5:45 p.m. It was from Clara Vargas. Mr. Vance, please be assured that your father is in excellent hands. St. Jude's is a Tier 1 cardiac care center, and our coronary observation unit is fully equipped to monitor and stabilize patients with valve leakage. Doctor. Eris, our attending cardiologist, has reviewed your father's chart and confirmed there is no immediate medical danger in remaining in our unit while your family's trust conducts its evaluation. As a public facility, we work daily with private trust compliance. Ms. Vivian Vance's Friday 5 p.m. timeline is standard for out-of-network evaluations. I have updated Dr. Eris, and he has noted that if the trust does not approve the transfer to Mercy, we are prepared to schedule Mr. Vance's procedure here in our primary theater on Monday morning under his standard Medicare coverage. I will keep you all updated on his vitals. Warm regards, Clara Vargas, LCSW. Vivian turned off the car engine. The sudden silence that rushed into the cabin was thick, almost physical. She sat in the dark car, listening to the quiet, metallic tink, tink, tink of the cooling engine block. Her internal calculation had been flawless. By removing her personal identity from the equation and replacing it with a cold, faceless trust, she had forced her family into an arena where their emotional currency was worthless. In the past, if Vivian had delayed sending money, Leo would have screamed at her, calling her selfish, and Helen would have wept, claiming Vivian was killing her father. But they couldn't scream at Clara Vargas. They couldn't accuse a licensed medical social worker of playing corporate games without looking like unstable, high-risk family members. By trying to bully Vivian through the email thread, Leo had instead forced the hospital's own staff to defend their quality of care and state clearly, in writing, that Arthur was perfectly safe where he was. The illusion of the medical emergency had been thoroughly dismantled. The transfer to Mercy was now officially documented as what it had always been, a luxury upgrade, a choice of vanity, not a necessity of life. Vivian opened her car door. The damp, cool air of the garage washed over her. She grabbed her tote bag, stepped out, and locked the car with a quiet double chirp of the remote. She walked toward the elevator lobby, her heels clicking in a sharp, steady rhythm against the concrete floor. She pressed the button for the 24th floor. As the elevator ascended, the pressure in her ears shifted slightly, a gentle physical reminder of the distance she was placing between herself and the chaos at St. Jude's. When she stepped into her apartment, the silence was there to greet her. The wide plank oak floors were clean. The air was dry and smelled faintly of the lavender she had used to wipe the counters the night before. On the high shelf, her grandmother's walnut clock ticked away, clack, 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 a steady, unbothered sentinel. She set her keys on the console, took off her wool coat, and hung it neatly in the entryway closet. She looked at the kitchen island, where the blue light of her laptop screen was dark. 60 miles away, in a crowded, noisy observation ward smelling of bleach and old broth, Helen and Leo were sitting under the hum of fluorescent lights, staring at their phones. They were realizing that the golden tap had not just been turned off, it had been encased in steel, and they had no tools to break it open. The heavy brass fixtures of the bathtub clicked as Vivian turned them, a solid mechanical sound that was immediately followed by the deep, hollow roar of water hitting the porcelain. She stood over the tub, watching the steam rise in thick, lazy curls, fogging the large, frameless mirror on the opposite wall. The bathroom was tiled in dark charcoal slate, cold and clean under her bare feet. She reached for a large glass jar on the floating shelf. Inside were heavy, translucent crystals of Epsom salt infused with eucalyptus and mint. She took a small cedar scoop, plunging it into the jar. The dry, scraping rasp of the wooden scoop against the salt crystals was loud in the small room, a sharp, granular sound. She measured out 3 level scoops, letting the heavy white crystals fall into the rushing hot water. They dissolved instantly, leaving the water clear and smelling faintly of a damp forest after a storm. This was her evening ritual, a physical routine she had maintained for years to wash away the static of the corporate world. She stepped out of her clothes, folding them into neat, precise squares before placing them in the laundry hamper. Before stepping into the water, she picked up her personal phone, which she had left on the marble vanity. The screen was dark, but a single green light was pulsing in the corner. She unlocked it and swiped past the lock screen. There were no new emails on the hospital thread. Helen and Leo were likely still digesting Clara Vargas's response, or perhaps Leo was currently pacing the St. Jude's cafeteria, muttering about bureaucrats. But there was a text message on her personal line, sent at 8:42 p.m., from a number she hadn't saved but recognized instantly. Aunt Linda. Aunt Linda was Helen's older sister, the self-appointed matriarch of the family gossip network. She was the one who kept track of every cousin's divorce, every uncle's bankruptcy, and every family rumor, turning them into prayer requests for her weekly church circle. Linda, Vivian dear, I was talking to your poor mother tonight. She is absolutely beside herself, crying so hard she can barely breathe. She says your father is stuck in a loud hallway at the county hospital, and you're refusing to let them access his medical money because of some trust. I know you've done very well for yourself in the city, Vivian, but family is family. Don't let money harden your heart. Your father worked 40 years at the plant to put food on the table. He deserves better than a county ward. Please do the right thing and call your mother. We are all praying for you to make the right choice. Vivian leaned against the cold slate wall, her shoulder pressing against the cool stone. She ran an internal calculation. Helen's move was classic. Having lost direct leverage over Vivian, and having failed to bypass her through the bank or her employer, Helen had retreated to her next line of defense, the extended family. She had called Linda, painted herself as the weeping victim, and portrayed Vivian as the cold, wealthy city daughter who was hoarding her cash while her father died in a hallway. In the past, this tactic had been incredibly effective. The sheer weight of family opinion, the fear of being talked about behind her back, the dread of being labeled selfish by her aunts and uncles, had driven Vivian to perform miracles. She had paid for car repairs, cleared credit card debts, and funded family dinners, all to buy the right to be seen as good in their eyes. But now, as she looked at Linda's message, she felt only a quiet, clinical assessment of the emotional math. To reply to Linda would require an explanation. She would have to explain the out-of-network waiver, She would have to explain that the surgery was fully covered by Medicare. She would have to explain Leo's laziness and the fact that Arthur was in no medical danger. And what would be the return on that expenditure of energy? Linda would listen, her voice full of sweet, concerned murmurs. Then, the moment she hung up, she would call Helen and say, "Vivian is being very defensive about her money. I think the city has changed her." The gossip would not stop. It would merely evolve to accommodate the new details. The metabolic calculator came up with a clean, round 0. Vivian did not type a response. She did not defend herself. She did not even block the number. She simply swiped left on the message thread and tapped the red delete button. The screen flickered, and Aunt Linda's long, guilt-laden paragraph vanished into nothingness. She set the phone face down on the dry marble vanity, turned off the bathroom lights, and stepped into the tub. The hot water rose around her skin, a heavy, enveloping warmth that immediately quieted the chill in her bones. She slid down until the water reached her collarbone, her head resting against the soft, inflated pillow at the back of the tub. She closed her eyes. In the dark, the steam was thick, smelling of sharp mint and warm wood. The water was a physical boundary, a warm, liquid wall that isolated her from the world. 60 miles away, the family phone lines were likely buzzing, her name being passed back and forth like a dirty cup. They were dissecting her character, whispering about her greed, and wrapping their resentment in the language of concern. But none of it could cross the 30 miles of highway. None of it could penetrate the triple-paned glass of her apartment. And none of it could touch her in the warm, dark water. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the steam fill her lungs, and listened to the steady, quiet drip of the faucet. Drip, 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 marking the peaceful passage of her evening, while her family's frantic, manipulative storm raged completely out of reach. At 7:15 a.m. on Friday, the hiss of the steam iron was the loudest sound in Vivian's apartment. She stood in her dressing room, holding her heavy stainless steel iron. She pressed the steam button, releasing a hot, white cloud that smelled faintly of clean water and heated metal. On the padded board lay a crisp, white poplin button-down shirt. She slid the heavy iron down the placket, watching the small, stubborn wrinkles around the buttonholes flatten and disappear instantly under the heat. This was her physical routine. She never sent her cotton shirts to the dry cleaners. She preferred to iron them herself. It was a precise, tactile task that required her complete focus. If she moved too quickly, she risked burning the fine fabric. If she moved too slowly, she would leave a yellowed scorch mark. She ironed the cuffs, then the collar, folding the fabric back with a neat, crisp crease. She slipped the warm shirt over her shoulders. The freshly pressed cotton was stiff, smooth, and smelled of dry heat. As she buttoned it from the bottom up, she felt her posture naturally align, her shoulders dropping into their usual defensive set. She walked into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of chilled water, and picked up her phone. The Friday deadline she had set, 5 p.m., was now less than 10 hours away. The tension in her family's camp had clearly reached a boiling point over the night. She opened the email app. The hospital thread had exploded with a flurry of messages between 3 a.m. and 7 a.m. The most recent email, sent at 6:45 a.m., was from Clara Vargas, the social worker. "Good morning, Ms. Vance and Mr. Vance. Dr. Aris has completed his early morning rounds in the coronary observation unit. He notes that Mr. Vance's vitals remain stable, though his blood pressure showed a mild spike around midnight, which has since been managed with medication. Because we are approaching the weekend, Dr. Eris has tentatively placed Mr. Vance on the Monday morning surgery schedule here at St. Jude's. To officially clear him for our in-network theater, our billing department requires either a standard copay deposit of $1,500 or a signed financial hardship waiver to defer the cost. Please let us know if your family's trust will be covering this standard copay deposit directly, or if we should proceed with the hardship documentation. If we proceed with the transfer to Mercy Pavilion instead, the $12,000 transfer deposit must be cleared before our transport team can be scheduled. Best regards, Clara Vargas, LCSW. Vivian took a slow, deliberate sip of her water. The cold liquid was sharp against her throat. She stared at the figure in the email. $1,500. The sheer staggering contrast of the numbers laid the truth bare. The actual out-of-pocket cost to save her father's life, to replace his failing heart valve at a fully accredited cardiac center under his existing insurance, was a mere $1,500. The other $50,000+ her family had been frantically demanding from her, the money that had caused Helen to weep, Leo to rage, and Aunt Linda to send guilt-laden texts, was entirely the price of Leo's pride. It was the cost of a private room, a skyline view, and an ego-stroking name on a private wing plaque. She scrolled up to see Leo's reply, sent at 7:12 a.m. Leo, do not sign any hardship waivers. We are absolutely not signing those. My father worked 40 years and has private insurance. He is not a charity case. We are currently waiting on the Trust's final decision for the Mercy Pavilion transfer, which our representative said will be released today. The Trust will handle the deposit. Do not schedule the Monday surgery at St. Jude's yet. Vivian ran the numbers through her internal calculator. Leo was terrified. He was terrified of the hardship waiver because signing it would require him to submit his parents' actual tax returns and bank statements to the county, exposing the fact that he had bled their accounts dry. He was also terrified of the $1,500 copay because even that small, reasonable amount was more than he could produce. He had no credit, no savings, and no pride left to trade. He was entirely, desperately dependent on the Trust agreeing to the $52,000 luxury transfer. He had spent the last 24 hours building a narrative where the county hospital was a dangerous slum, and now the social worker had politely but firmly pointed out that a simple $1,500 payment would solve the entire crisis. Vivian leaned her hands on her clean kitchen island. She began to construct her response. She would not send the $52,000. She had never intended to. But she would not play the villain they wanted her to be either. She would wait. She would let the clock run down. At exactly 4:59 p.m., 1 minute before her self-imposed deadline, she would release the trustee decision. The decision would be simple, logical, and legally unassailable. The Trust has denied the elective out-of-network transfer to Mercy Pavilion due to a lack of medical necessity, as St. Jude's is fully equipped to perform the surgery in-network. However, to ensure the patient's health and safety, the Trust will directly cover the $1,500 in-network copay. The $1,500 will be wired directly to the billing department of St. Jude's County Hospital. No funds will be dispersed to individual bank accounts. It was a perfect, quiet execution. She was saving her father's life. She was removing any legitimate complaint they could make to the extended family. Aunt Linda could not claim Vivian had hardened her heart, and Helen could not claim Vivian was letting her father die. But at the same time, she was completely destroying Leo's vanity. She was forcing him to face the reality of his father staying in a county ward. and she was doing it without giving him or Helen a single dollar of cash to touch, control, or claim credit for. She turned off her phone screen. The kitchen returned to its calm, silent state. Outside, the early morning sun was finally breaking through the gray November fog, casting long, sharp lanes of bright light across her wide plank oak floors. Vivian picked up her leather tote bag, slung it over her shoulder, and walked toward the door. Her white poplin shirt felt crisp and unyielding against her skin, a clean, protective armor for the final hours of the Cold War. By 3:30 p.m. on Friday, the quiet in the offices of Miller and Vance had taken on a hollow, weekend eve quality. The heavy glass doors down the hall closed with soft pneumatic sighs as her colleagues slipped away early to catch trains or beat the evening traffic. Vivian remained at her desk, finishing her weekly wrap-up. Her physical routine at the end of every Friday was identical, a meticulous ritual designed to leave no unfinished business hanging over her weekend. She stood before her tall, brushed steel filing cabinet. She held a stack of quarterly reports, their edges perfectly aligned. One by one, she slid the heavy manila folders into the suspension frames. Clink, clink, clink. The metallic ring of the brass hanging clips sliding along the steel rails was sharp and clean in the quiet office. She pushed the heavy drawer closed, enjoying the solid, muffled thump of the magnetic latch sealing it shut. She walked back to her desk and took out a soft, gray microfiber cloth. She wiped down her dual monitors, removing the microscopic dust that had settled over the week, then aligned her keyboard exactly parallel to the edge of the glass. The air in her office smelled of fresh toner and the faint, sweet scent of the green tea she had finished an hour ago. She sat down, woke her screen, and opened her personal email client. It was 4:15 p.m. The hospital thread had descended into a state of raw, unvarnished panic. Leo and Helen had spent the afternoon realizing that Vivian was not checking her messages, was not answering her phone, and was completely unreachable. A message from Helen, sent at 4:02 p.m., was filled with typos, the grammar disintegrating under the weight of her anxiety. Helen, Vivian, please, we need to know. The billing lady here says they have to finalize the Monday schedule by 4:30. Leo is talking to the supervisor, but they say they can't hold the bed without the transfer clear. We don't have the 1,500 either. We need you to help us. Please. The trust has to answer now. Your father is so tired, Vivian. Vivian stared at the screen. She ran an internal calculation. She knew the St. Jude's billing office technically closed its administrative doors at 4:30 p.m., but she also knew that emergency admissions and critical co-payments could be processed 24 hours a day through the main ER billing portal. The 4:30 schedule cutoff was an artificial pressure point. Leo had likely heard a clerk mention the administrative hours and had twisted it into a life-or-death crisis to force Vivian to break her silence before her 5 p.m. deadline. She would not break. She would let the clock run down to the very last tick. She opened her draft folder and pulled up the email she had spent her lunch hour meticulously crafting. She clicked on her bank's secure portal in a separate tab. She had already processed the $1,500 wire transfer from her personal checking account. The destination was not Leo's account, nor was it Helen's. The money had been wired directly to the St. Jude's County Hospital General Billing account, marked with Arthur Vance's patient identification number and his specific Monday surgical code. She took a screenshot of the completed transaction receipt, showing the federal wire confirmation number, the exact time of the deposit, and the non-refundable direct-to-institution destination. She attached the screenshot to her draft email. She sat back in her leather chair, her hands folded in her lap. She watched the digital clock in the bottom right corner of her monitor. 4:51 p.m., 4:54 p.m., 4:57 p.m. The silence of her office was absolute, a heavy, protective dome that insulated her from the frantic energy currently vibrating through the county hospital ward 60 miles away. She could almost picture them. Leo pacing the linoleum floor, his phone held in his hand like a weapon that had run out of ammunition. Helen sitting in the orange plastic chair, wiping her eyes with a damp tissue, looking at the door every time a nurse walked past. At 4:59 p.m., Vivian leaned forward. She clicked the send button. The email vanished, CCing Helen, Leo, and Clara Vargas, the social worker. Dear Ms. Vargas, the trustees of the Vance Family Trust have completed their medical necessity and compliance review for the proposed out-of-network transfer of Arthur Vance. Because St. Jude's County Hospital is a Tier 1 accredited cardiac facility fully equipped to perform the required valve replacement in-network, the trustees have officially denied the elective transfer to the Mercy Private Pavilion. The trust will not disburse the $12,000 transfer deposit. However, to ensure the patient's immediate health and safety, the trustees have approved the direct coverage of the standard in-network copay deposit of $1,500 for the Monday morning surgery at St. Jude's. This payment has been successfully processed via federal wire directly to the St. Jude's billing department. I have attached the wire confirmation receipt below for your records. Please coordinate directly with your billing office to ensure the Monday surgery remains on schedule. No further funds will be disbursed for elective upgrades. Sincerely, Vivian Vance, Representative, Vance Family Trust. Vivian watched the outbox clear. She shut down her computer. The dual screens went black, reflecting her own calm, unbothered face in the dark glass. She stood up, grabbed her leather tote bag, and locked her office door behind her. As she walked toward the elevators, she felt a profound, cold sense of balance. She had saved her father's life, she had paid the bill, but she had done it on her terms, through a faceless system, without giving them a single dollar of cash to touch, control, or use to feed Leo's fragile ego. This was the end of the first battle, but as she stepped into the quiet elevator and felt the smooth drop of the car, she knew the war was far from over. She had shown them the boundary, and over the weekend, the reality of their defeat would begin to sink in. It was time to begin the silent preparation for the next phase. The quiet of her bedroom was interrupted only by the slow, dry clack, clack, clack of a heavy brass dial. Vivian stood in her walk-in closet, her fingers resting lightly on the cold, textured dial of the wall safe, hidden behind the full-length, oak-framed mirror. She turned the dial carefully, matching her movements to her breath. Left to 42, twice past 0. Right to 18, left to 73. With a dull, heavy thunk, the internal steel bolts retracted. She pulled the thick metal door open, the heavy hinges swinging silently in the dim closet light. The safe smelled of cold steel, desiccant packets, and dry paper. Inside lay a single thick blue accordion folder. Vivian retrieved it, set it on her vanity, and pushed the safe door shut, spinning the dial to lock it once more. This was her physical routine, the methodical retrieval of her private archives whenever she needed to anchor her decisions in hard, documentable reality. She walked into her living room carrying the heavy blue folder. She set it on the dark oak dining table, pulled out a high-backed chair, and sat down. Before opening the folder, she checked her phone, which had been silent on the console since she arrived home. It was now 7:45 p.m. There were no emails from Clara Vargas. The social worker had likely gone home for the weekend, satisfied that the Monday surgery was funded and scheduled. But there was a series of direct text messages from Leo, sent between 6:15 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. Leo, you think you're clever, don't you? You humiliated us in front of the social worker. Do you have any idea how it felt standing there while she read that email out loud? Dad is refusing the surgery now. He says he'd rather die than be treated like a charity case by his own daughter. If anything happens to him on Monday, his blood is on your hands, Vivian. We're talking to a lawyer. You can't use some fake trust to keep our money from us. We know our rights. Vivian stared at the screen. Our money. The phrase was a perfect window into the parasite's mind. In Leo's universe, the wealth she had built through 10 years of 80-hour weeks, missed sleep, and absolute self-denial was not hers. It was a collective family pool that she was illegally keeping from them. He truly believed he had rights to her bank accounts. She ran an internal calculation on Leo's legal threat. She knew no reputable lawyer would take a consultation with a 32-year-old unemployed man claiming his sister was legally obligated to fund an elective private hospital transfer. But she also knew Leo's desperation would drive him to do something foolish. He would search for any avenue of leverage, and the most obvious target was the only remaining asset her parents owned, the family home in Oak Creek. Vivian opened the blue accordion folder. Inside were the deeds, bank statements, and legal filings she had spent the last 2 years quietly assembling. She pulled out a thick document bound in a gray plastic spine, promissory note and security instrument, Oak Creek property. 2 years ago, Leo had convinced Arthur to sign a $60,000 home equity line of credit, HELOC. Leo had claimed he needed the capital for a guaranteed logistics venture that ended up collapsing within 90 days. But Vivian's private investigator had discovered something far worse. Arthur's signature on the secondary loan documents wasn't his. It was a crude, shaky forgery. Leo had signed his father's name, used his own phone number as the contact, and directed the funds to a private digital wallet. When the bank had threatened foreclosure 6 months ago due to missed payments, Helen had called Vivian, weeping, claiming the bank was making a mistake and begging for help. Vivian hadn't paid the bank on her parents' behalf. Instead, she had done something far more permanent. She had operated through a shell LLC she controlled, Vance Holdings, and quietly purchased the delinquent debt note directly from the bank's secondary asset department. The bank got their money. Helen and Leo were told that the bank had granted a temporary hardship grace period. But the reality was far different. Vivian was no longer just their daughter. She was their mortgage holder. She owned the debt on the Oak Creek house. She held the legal power to foreclose on her parents' home at any moment of her choosing. She looked at the signature page of the HELOC. Beside her father's forged signature was Leo's bold, childish scrawl as the witness. She had kept the forensic document examiner's report in the folder as well, sealed in a clear plastic sleeve. It was her ultimate leverage, a clean, legally binding document proving Leo had committed bank fraud and grand larceny. Vivian pulled her laptop toward her. She opened her secure email client and drafted a message to her real estate attorney, Richard. Richard, please prepare the formal Notice of Default and Intent to Foreclose for the Oak Creek property under Vance Holdings, LLC. Do not file it with the county clerk yet. I want the paperwork drafted, signed, and held in escrow, ready for immediate execution. We will discuss the trigger parameters on Monday morning. Best, Vivian. She hit send. The physical anchor of her apartment, the quiet, the cold glass of water on the table, the dry scent of the old loan documents felt solid and unshakable. She closed the blue folder, tying the black ribbon around it with a tight, neat bow. She had spent years playing the shield, absorbing their blows, their insults, and their quiet resentment, while quietly paying their bills to keep them from falling over the edge. But now she was shifting. She was no longer protecting them from their own decay. She was quietly gathering the reins of their financial reality into her own hands. If Leo wanted to play with lawyers, she would let him. But when the dust settled, they would realize that the very roof over their heads didn't belong to the bank, and it certainly didn't belong to them. It belonged to the daughter they had kicked out at 18, and she was finally ready to call the debt. The hollow, rhythmic tack-tack of an eggshell cracking against the rim of a white ceramic bowl was the only sound in the kitchen at 8:30 a.m. on Saturday. Vivian stood over her small stainless steel saucepan, watching the water. It was not boiling, but simmering, a gentle, trembling heat that sent tiny, microscopic bubbles rising from the bottom to the surface. She had added a single tablespoon of white vinegar to the water, the sour, clean scent rising with the steam. Using a spoon, she swirled the water in a slow, clockwise circle, creating a quiet, spinning vortex in the center of the pan. She tipped the bowl, letting the raw eggs slide gently into the middle of the whirlpool. The white immediately bloomed like a pale, delicate cloud, wrapping itself around the bright yellow yolk in a perfect, protective sphere. She lowered the heat, stepped back, and watched it float. This was her Saturday morning routine. It required patience and a steady hand. If the water was too hot, the white would shred into useless white ribbons. If the water was too cold, the egg would flatten against the bottom and stick. It was a micro moment of complete control, a physical anchor that set the tone for her weekend. She walked over to the kitchen island, where her phone lay face down on the dark wood. She picked it up and unlocked the screen. There was a missed call from Helen at 8:14 a.m., followed by a voicemail notification. Vivian tapped the screen to read the automated transcription. "Vivian, it's your mother. We're still in the observation room. Your father slept a little bit, but his back is sore from these terrible mattresses. Leo went down to the hospital billing desk this morning. He tried to cancel the Monday surgery because we decided we wanted to get a second opinion from a specialist at Mercy first. We wanted to take that $1,500 you sent and use it to pay the private ambulance transport and the consultation fee. But the woman at the desk was so rude to him. She said the money is locked. She said even if we cancel the surgery, they can't refund the cash to us. She said the wire can only be sent back to the exact trust account it came from. Vivian, why did you do that? Why did you lock the money? Leo is so upset. He's been arguing with them for an hour. We need that cash to help your father get out of here. Please call the billing desk and tell them to release the refund to Leo's card." Vivian stood in the quiet of her kitchen, her phone held loosely in her hand. She ran an internal calculation. The depravity of the move was breathtaking, yet it fit perfectly within the mathematical parameters of her family's behavior. Leo had actually tried to cancel his own father's life-saving heart surgery, to pull Arthur off the Monday operating schedule for the sole purpose of pocketing $1,500 of Vivian's money. He had dressed it up in the language of concern, a second opinion, ambulance transport. But the reality was simple. He wanted the cash. He wanted to walk out of the hospital with $1,500 of her money in his pocket, leaving Arthur to go home to Oak Creek with a leaking heart valve and a ticking clock. And Helen had supported him. She had sat in the room, watched her 32-year-old son walk down to the billing office to cancel her husband's surgery, and then called her daughter to complain that the hospital wouldn't hand him the cash. They did not see Arthur as a patient who needed saving. They saw his illness as an investment opportunity, a crisis they could leverage to extract a liquid payout from the wealthy daughter. Vivian turned back to the stove. She took a slotted spoon, lifted the poached egg from the water, and placed it on a thick slice of toasted sourdough. The white was firm and perfectly smooth, holding the hot, liquid yolk securely inside. She sprinkled a few flakes of gray sea salt over the top. She did not feel a sudden spike of anger. She did not feel her stomach tighten. The metabolic calculator in her mind had already processed the emotional cost of their greed years ago. She had known they were parasites. She had simply forgotten how hungry they could get when the host stopped willingly feeding them. She sat at the dining table, her knife slicing through the center of the egg. The warm yellow yolk spilled out across the dark crust of the bread, a slow, rich pool. She typed a single text message to Helen. Vivian. The wire was processed under corporate trust guidelines. All refunded disbursements are legally mandated to return to the originating source account to prevent tax fraud. The billing office cannot alter this protocol. The $1,500 will remain with St. Jude's billing department to cover the Monday's surgery copay. If you cancel the surgery, the funds will return to the trust, and the file will be closed. She hit send. She set the phone face down. She took a bite of her toast. The salt, the rich yolk, the sourdough. It was perfect. Outside, the morning sun was climbing higher, burning away the last of the gray river fog, revealing the clean, sharp lines of the city skyline. She had spent her entire adult life feeling a quiet, heavy guilt for escaping them, for living in a place with clean air and quiet rooms while they struggled in their self-made chaos. But as she chewed her breakfast, she realized the guilt was completely gone. It had evaporated the moment Leo had tried to trade his father's heartbeat for $1,500 of her cash. The lines of the war were now clean, cold, and final. She had built the trap, and they were spinning their wheels in the center of it, completely blind to the steel walls closing in around them. At 3:15 p.m. on Saturday, Vivian was on her hands and knees on the tiled floor of her balcony, surrounded by the quiet hum of the afternoon. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the distant faint smell of salt from the river below. Beside her lay a small bag of organic potting soil, a new, unglazed terracotta pot, and a root-bound maidenhair fern she had bought from the local nursery the previous week. The fern's delicate, bright green fronds trembled slightly in the light breeze, their thin black stems like wires. She began her routine. She slid her fingers inside the plastic nursery pot, gently squeezing the sides to loosen the grip of the soil. With a soft, wet slide, the root ball came free. It was a dense, choked mass of dark brown fibers, the roots wrapping around themselves so tightly they had begun to strangle the plant, leaving no room for water or air to penetrate. Using her bare hands, Vivian began to untangle them. The physical sensation was grounding. The damp soil was cool against her palms, sticking to the lines of her skin and under her fingernails. She worked with extreme patience, her thumb gently pressing into the center of the root mass, teasing the tightly wound threads apart, shaking loose the dead, dry dirt. It was a slow, delicate process. If she pulled too hard, she would tear the main taproot and kill the fern. This was her silent preparation. Just as she was untangling the choked life of the plant, she was quietly dismantling the web of financial lies her family had spun around themselves for a decade. She stood up, wiped her hands on a dry cloth, and walked inside to her desk to retrieve her laptop. She carried it back to the balcony, setting it on the small metal table. She opened her email. A new message from Richard, her real estate attorney, had arrived at 2:45 p.m. Vivian, attached is the drafted notice of default and demand for payment for the Oak Creek property under Vance Holdings, LLC. I have also completed the preliminary forensic audit of the HELOC documentation. As you suspected, the signature of Arthur Vance on the secondary mortgage note is a clear forgery. We ran a trace on the mobile notary who authorized the closing, a registered agent named Thomas Cole. His license was revoked by the state last winter for participating in a series of fraudulent equity stripping schemes in the Tri-County area. If you choose to file a formal criminal referral for bank fraud and identity theft against Leo, the state's attorney will have an open and shut case. The signature on the loan disbursement is linked directly to a digital account under Leo's name. The notice of default is ready to be filed with the county registrar. Please advise on when you would like to execute the filing and if we should initiate the criminal referral simultaneously. Best, Richard. Vivian leaned back against her chair, her eyes tracking the cold, legal terminology on the screen. She ran an internal calculation. She looked through the glass doors at her maidenhair fern, its roots now loose and spread out, waiting for the clean, new soil. If she executed the foreclosure now, and if she filed the criminal referral against Leo today, the immediate impact would be catastrophic. Leo would be arrested by early next week. Helen would panic. Her screaming phone calls would saturate Vivian's voicemail, and the shock would almost certainly cause Arthur's blood pressure to spike, jeopardizing his Monday surgery. Arthur's physical survival of the valve replacement was the absolute baseline. She wanted him to live, not out of a lingering, desperate need for his approval. That had died years ago. But out of a cold, structured sense of justice. She wanted him fully recovered, sitting in his own living room, when the reality of what his golden son had done finally landed. She wanted them to have no excuses, no medical emergencies to hide behind, no crises to use as shields to avoid their own accountability. She typed her reply to Richard. Richard, hold the notice of default and the criminal referral file in absolute escrow. Do not contact the county registrar or the state's attorney yet. Arthur Vance's surgery is scheduled for Monday morning at St. Jude's. He will require at least 10 days of post-operative recovery and physical therapy. We will maintain absolute silence until he is discharged and back at the Oak Creek property. I want the trap entirely set, but we will not pull the trigger until Monday, November 24th. That gives them exactly 2 weeks of quiet recovery before we execute. Thank you, Vivian. She hit send and closed her laptop. She returned to her knees on the balcony floor. She scooped a handful of the rich, dark organic soil and placed it at the bottom of the terracotta pot. She set the untangled fern in the center, its roots now free to breathe, and began to pack the fresh, damp earth around the base, pressing it down with her thumbs. She stood up, picked up her small copper watering can, and gently showered the soil. The water sank in instantly, turning the earth a deep, dark black. She walked into the bathroom and turned on the hot water. She held her hands under the stream, watching the brown dirt dissolve and wash down the white porcelain drain. She used a small wooden brush to scrub under her nails until her hands were completely clean, smooth, and pale once more. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was calm, her breathing slow and even. The targets were currently sitting in the crowded, sterile observation room at St. Jude's, completely unaware that the countdown had begun. They thought they were playing a game of chicken over a $1,500 hospital copay. They had no idea that in exactly 14 days, the very ground they walked on would belong to the daughter they had cast aside, and she was going to systematically strip away every single illusion they had left. The sharp, slightly medicinal scent of carnauba wax and black leather paste hung heavy in the Sunday morning air. Vivian sat at her dining table, a newspaper spread out to protect the dark oak wood. Before her stood her favorite pair of black leather riding boots, structured, calfskin knee-highs that she wore during the cold city winters. She wrapped a soft yellow flannel cloth tightly around her index and middle fingers, dipping it into the small round tin of premium wax. She worked in tiny, firm circles, rubbing the black paste into the scuffed leather of the heel. The friction of the cloth against the hide created a warm, faint heat. Once the leather had absorbed the wax, she took a heavy horsehair brush. Shuck, shuck, shuck. The rhythmic, dry scratch of the stiff bristles across the leather was a comforting, familiar sound. With each stroke, the dull, gray-black wax began to transform, rising into a deep, dark, mirrored gloss that reflected the pale morning light streaming through the window. This was her Sunday morning routine, a physical preparation for the intense business week ahead, ensuring every detail of her appearance was flawless, polished, and impenetrable. Her phone, sitting on the corner of the newspaper, vibrated twice. Vivian did not stop. She finished the second boot, buffing the toe box until it was smooth as glass before laying the brush down. She peeled the flannel cloth off her fingers, tossed it onto the newspaper, and picked up the device. It was a text from Helen, sent at 9:14 a.m. Helen, Vivian, your father's surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. The doctors said we have to check him into the surgical wing by 5:30. Leo and I are going to the hospital chapel tonight at 6 to pray with Pastor Thomas. Your father keeps asking if you're coming. He looks so small in that bed, Vivian. He's scared. Please, whatever is going on with this trust, put it aside for one night. Your family needs you. Vivian stared at the words, her thumb resting on the cold bezel of the screen. Your father keeps asking if you're coming. The metabolic calculator in her mind immediately began to dissect the emotional geography of the message. It was the ultimate weapon in Helen's arsenal, the simulated deathbed reconciliation. By framing the invitation around Arthur's fear and his supposed asking for her, Helen was attempting to pull Vivian back into the family theater. She knew the reality of Arthur's indifference. Arthur had not asked for Vivian in 10 years. When she had graduated at the top of her class from university, he hadn't attended because Leo had a minor engine issue with his truck that required Arthur's tools. When she had moved into her first apartment in the city, carrying her 3 cardboard boxes up 4 flights of stairs by herself, Arthur hadn't called to see if she had arrived safely. The last time Arthur had truly looked at her and spoken directly to her was the night she turned 18. She remembered the wet, cold smell of the November air on the porch. She remembered the sound of her canvas duffel bag hitting the muddy grass of the driveway after Arthur had kicked it down the steps. He had stood on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, his face hard and completely devoid of warmth. You think you're better than us because you saved that money? He had spat, his voice trembling with a bitter, deep-seated resentment. You're no daughter of mine. Get off my property. He had cast her out because she had refused to sign over her college savings account to fund Leo's first commercial truck venture, a business that, like all of Leo's ideas, had gone bankrupt within 8 months. Now, Arthur was asking for her because he was facing a major surgical procedure, because the county hospital ward was loud and unfamiliar, and because the illusion of his perfect family was beginning to fray at the edges. Vivian calculated the energy cost of attending the chapel service. If she went, she would be walking into a trap designed to force a public display of submission. Helen would weep and cling to her in front of the pastor, using the religious setting to make Vivian feel guilty for her coldness. Leo would stand in the corner, his eyes dark with resentment, waiting to make a passive-aggressive comment about her expensive coat or her fancy life. They would try to extract a promise of more money, using Arthur's vulnerability as a knife at her throat. She would be consenting to play the role of the cold, wealthy daughter who had finally come to her senses and returned to the fold. She stood up, walked to her closet, and placed her polished boots back on their cedar trees. She returned to the kitchen, picked up her phone, and drafted her response. Vivian, I have several executive client meetings tomorrow morning that cannot be rescheduled. I will not be able to attend the chapel service tonight. Please keep me updated on the surgeon's progress once he is out of theater tomorrow. I hope the procedure goes smoothly. She hit send. She did not add, I'm sorry. She did not offer to call Arthur. She did not explain herself. She simply laid down the boundary, cold and flat as a sheet of ice. She folded the newspaper, wrapping the dirty shoe polish cloths inside, and tossed the bundle into the trash chute down the hall. When she returned, the apartment was perfectly silent. The sun was fully up now, casting bright, clean, geometric shapes across her floor. She felt no regret. She felt no heavy, suffocating guilt. She had paid the $1,500 copay to save his life, fulfilling her moral obligation as a human being. But she was under no obligation to participate in the lie of their family unity. The stage was set for Monday morning. Her father would get his heart valve, and her family would get their survival. But the peace they felt would be temporary, a quiet 2-week grace period before the legal machinery she had set in motion finally ground them to dust. On Monday morning at 9:30 a.m., the corporate offices of Miller & Vance were operating with their usual clinical, silent precision. Vivian stood at her glass desk, her fingers resting on the heavy, solid brass cylinders of her perpetual desk calendar, a vintage, mechanical piece of German engineering. She turned the knurled knob slowly, feeling the physical, mechanical resistance of the internal gears. Clack, clack, clack. She watched the day, month, and date shift behind the small glass windows. Monday, November 10th. This was her physical routine. Every Monday morning, before she opened her email, before she looked at the market tickers, she turned the brass dials. It was a tactile reminder of the unyielding, steady march of time. No matter what storms raged, the calendar turned. The clock did not pause. She sat down, smoothed her tailored wool trousers over her knees, and took a sip of hot water from her ceramic mug. A single, thin slice of organic lemon floated in the water, casting a faint, sharp citrus scent into the air that mingled with the dry ozone of the office. She woke her terminal. On her screen, the world was a flurry of green and red financial indices, but her eyes went straight to her personal inbox. At 10:14 a.m., the email from Clara Vargas arrived. Dear Ms. Vance, I am writing to provide a brief update. Your father, Arthur Vance, was taken into the operating theater at 7:15 a.m. this morning, as scheduled. Dr. Aris and his surgical team are currently performing the valve replacement procedure. Your mother and brother are in the surgical waiting room. I wanted to formally confirm that our billing department has successfully cleared the $1,500 wire transfer from your trust. There are no outstanding deposits required for his standard admission or care. I will email you again once Dr. Aris has completed the procedure and your father is transferred to the recovery unit. Sincerely, Clara Vargas, LCSW. Vivian read the message once. She did not print it. She did not forward it. She simply dragged the email into her private folder labeled St. Jude's Admissions. At 11:30 a.m., her phone buzzed with a direct text from Helen. Helen, he is out. The doctor just came to the waiting room and said the valve is in. Arthur is in the recovery unit now. He's breathing on his own. They said we can see him for 5 minutes in an hour. Leo is going to get some coffee. I am so tired. Vivian stared at the words. She ran an internal calculation. The surgery was successful. Her father had survived. His physical recovery was now a matter of biological process and standard medical protocol. She calculated the recovery timeline with clinical precision. Days 1 through 3, intensive care monitoring, pain management, and stabilization. Arthur would be weak, heavily medicated, and mostly asleep. Days 4 through 7, transferred to the general cardiac ward, light physical therapy, and monitoring of his kidney metrics. Days 8 through 14, discharge to the Oak Creek property, home recovery, and restricted movement. During these 14 days, the family would slowly adjust to the post-surgical reality. They would think they had won. They would tell themselves that Vivian had caved, that her fake trust had paid the $1,500 because she was ultimately afraid of their anger or their guilt. Leo would sit in the living room at Oak Creek, drinking beer bought with Helen's Social Security check, bragging to his friends about how he had forced Vivian to pay the hospital. Helen would call Aunt Linda to report that Vivian had done the right thing in the end, though she was still so cold. They would wrap themselves in the warm, comfortable blanket of their own delusions. And while they rested in that soft, familiar space, Vivian would remain in absolute, unyielding silence. She would not call to check on Arthur's progress. She would not send flowers. She would not reply to Helen's updates. She would let the illusion of her quiet compliance fester in their minds, while the legal clock she had set on Saturday afternoon ticked down to the final second. She reached for her mouse and opened her calendar app. She scrolled forward exactly 2 weeks. Monday, November 24th. On that day, Arthur would be exactly 14 days post-op, fully healed, sitting in his favorite recliner, stable and out of medical danger. On that day, the shield of his medical emergency would be completely gone, and on that day, at exactly 9 a.m., Richard's office would file the notice of default and demand for payment for the Oak Creek property with the county registrar. Vance Holdings LLC, the shell company Vivian owned, would formally initiate foreclosure proceedings against her parents' home. At the same moment, the state's attorney would receive the completed forensic audit of the HELOC, detailing Leo's bank fraud and grand larceny, with his father's forged signature attached. She sat back in her chair, her hands resting flat on the cold glass of her desk. The quiet white noise of her corporate terminal filled the room, a steady mechanical hum that sounded like a long, drawn-out breath. She had spent her entire life waiting for them to see her, to love her, to validate her sacrifice. But as she stared at the bright blue block of November 24th on her screen, she realized that she didn't need them to see her anymore. She was going to make them feel her. The preparation was complete. The silent, heavy lines of her trap were laid deep beneath the foundation of their lives, and they were currently eating cafeteria food and drinking stale coffee, completely oblivious to the fact that their 2-week grace period had just begun. The rhythmic, solid thwack, thwack, thwack of a chef's knife against an end-grain walnut cutting board was the only sound in Vivian's kitchen at 7:30 p.m. on Wednesday. She stood at her island, her movements fluid and unhurried. Before her lay a single red onion, its outer skin a dry, papery purple that crackled softly under her fingers. She cut the onion in half, the sharp, pungent sulfur releasing into the air, causing her eyes to sting slightly, a clean physical sensation. With her high-carbon steel knife, she diced the onion into tiny, mathematically perfect squares, her knuckles guiding the flat of the blade with practiced ease. Next, she took 3 cloves of garlic. She placed the flat of her blade over a clove and struck the spine of the knife with the heel of her hand. A muffled pop echoed through the room as the clove crushed beneath the steel, releasing its rich, sticky oils. This was her physical routine, the slow, sensory preparation of her Wednesday evening meal, a simple vegetable curry that required precision, heat, and time. She swiped the diced onions and crushed garlic into a small bowl, set her knife down, and reached for her phone to check the timer. Instead, she saw a text message notification from her cousin Sarah. Sarah was the only member of the extended family who had stayed out of the gossip circles, a quiet, observant woman who had always treated Vivian with a distant but polite respect. Sarah. Hey Viv, I know we don't talk much, but I saw this on your mom's Facebook page this afternoon. I know how much you've done for them over the years, and this just felt wrong. I thought you should see it. Attached was a high-resolution screenshot. Vivian picked up her phone, her thumb tracing the smooth glass screen. She zoomed in on the image. It was a photograph taken in the cardiac recovery ward at St. Jude's. The lighting was harsh and yellow, reflecting off the stainless steel IV poles and the pale, sterile wall behind the bed. In the bed sat Arthur, sitting upright, a plastic nasal cannula in his nose, looking tired but undeniably stable. Standing right next to the bed, with his arm draped around Arthur's shoulder, was Leo. Leo was wearing a clean, fitted black t-shirt, his hair styled, his chin held high, looking directly into the camera with a smug, heroic grin. Below the photo was a long, public caption written by Helen. "Our prayers have been answered. Arthur's valve surgery was a complete success on Monday. He is sitting up and already laughing. I don't know what we would have done without our wonderful Leo." When the hospital demanded the deposit and said they wouldn't schedule the surgery without it, Leo didn't hesitate. He took his own savings, money he had been putting aside for his future business, and paid the deposit directly to St. Jude's so his father could live. He didn't ask for anything in return. He is our absolute angel. Meanwhile, some people who live in fancy city apartments and pretend to have trusts couldn't even be bothered to answer our calls, visit, or send a single dollar to help. They let money harden their hearts. But God is good, and He gave us a real son who knows what family means. Please keep praying for Arthur's recovery. Vivian scrolled down to read the comments in the screenshot. Aunt Linda, God bless Leo. He is a true saint. Arthur raised a real man. Shame on those who turn their backs on their own blood. We are praying for you all. Uncle Bob, incredible sacrifice, Leo. You're a good man. Let the selfish ones sleep in their high-rise towers. Real wealth is family. Leo, just doing what any real son would do. Family first, always. Vivian leaned against the marble counter, the cool stone pressing through the thin cotton of her shirt. She looked down at her hands. The smell of raw garlic and sweet onions still clung to her skin. She ran an internal calculation. Helen and Leo knew the absolute truth. They had been CC'd on the email from Clara Vargas confirming that the $1,500 wire had cleared directly from Vivian's account. They had stood in the billing office and been told face-to-face by a hospital clerk that Vivian's money was locked into the Monday surgical schedule and could not be refunded. Yet, within 48 hours of Arthur surviving the surgery, they had constructed a complete, detailed, public lie. They had erased her $1,500 payment, turned Leo's empty pockets into a heroic sacrifice of personal savings, and used the platform to publicly humiliate Vivian in front of every relative, neighbor, and church member they knew. They had crossed the final line. In the past, a post like this would have shattered her. She would have felt a hot, choking wave of panic, a desperate urge to defend herself. She would have called Helen, screaming, or posted screenshots of her bank wire in the comments to prove her innocence. She would have let them drag her down into their mud, wasting her energy, her dignity, and her peace. But now, she felt nothing but a cool, crystalline stillness. She opened her browser, logged into her cloud storage, and uploaded Sarah's screenshot directly into the blue accordion folder's digital backup. She named the file exhibit_G_public_defamation_November 12th.png. She typed a reply to Sarah. "Vivian, thank you for sending this, Sarah. I appreciate you letting me know. I hope you're doing well." She set her phone down, face down, on the counter. She turned on the flame under her cast-iron skillet. She poured in a tablespoon of olive oil, watching the oil shimmer and slide across the dark metal. She added the onions and garlic, the kitchen immediately filling with a loud, sharp sizzle and the warm, sweet aroma of browning onion. The targets believed they had won. They believed that by publicly erasing her contribution and painting her as the villain, they had secured their victory. They were basking in the praise of their church friends, feeling the warm glow of their collective lies, fully expecting Vivian to remain silent and distant, as she always did. They were right about one thing: she was going to remain silent. But her silence was no longer a retreat. It was the quiet, holding breath of a predator that had already sprung the trap. The calendar on her wall still read Wednesday, November 12th. There were exactly 12 days left in the countdown. 12 days for Arthur to heal, 12 days for Leo to enjoy his public heroism, and 12 days before she pulled the string and let their entire fragile house of cards collapse into the dirt. At 7 a.m. on Thursday, the sharp, grassy aroma of stone-ground green tea filled the quiet morning air of Vivian's kitchen. She stood at her counter, performing her morning ritual with absolute focus. She took a small bamboo scoop, a chashaku, and measured exactly 2 scoops of vibrant jade-green ceremonial matcha powder into a fine mesh silver sieve. With the back of the scoop, she gently pressed the powder through the mesh, watching the bright green dust fall in a soft, silent mound at the bottom of her hand-fired dark clay bowl. She added exactly 2 ounces of water, heated to precisely 175 degrees. She took her bamboo whisk, the chasen, and began to whisk. Swish, 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 swish. Her wrist moved in a rapid, double-jointed, M-shaped pattern, her hand light but incredibly fast. The whisk scraped gently against the textured bottom of the clay bowl, a dry, rhythmic friction. Within 30 seconds, the dark green liquid bloomed with a thick, velvety layer of pale jade foam, a perfect, uniform froth that held the heat. She lifted the whisk, let the warm ceramic bowl rest in her palms, and closed her eyes, breathing in the clean, bitter, earthy steam. This was her physical routine, a moment of sensory grounding that prepared her mind for the long, clinical execution of her plans. She took her first sip, the liquid thick and savory, before reaching for her laptop on the kitchen island. She logged into her secure portal and opened her corporate mail client. There was a forwarded email from the general inbox of Vance Holdings, LLC, the shell company she controlled that held the delinquent mortgage note on her parents' home in Oak Creek. The email had been forwarded by her legal administrative assistant, Sarah, with a short note. "Vivian, this was sent to our public portal last night. Thought you'd want to see it." Vivian opened the attachment. It was a PDF letter, formatted with a clumsy, pre-designed corporate template Leo had clearly downloaded from the internet. He had signed it as Leo Vance, Chief Family Representative for Arthur Vance. Dear Vance Holdings Management, I am writing to you on behalf of my father, Arthur Vance, who is currently the primary deed holder of the Oak Creek property. As you may know from your records, there is an outstanding HELOC balance on this property. My father has just survived a major, life-threatening open-heart valve replacement surgery at St. Jude's County Hospital on Monday. He is currently in the recovery unit, facing a very long, difficult, and extremely expensive rehabilitation process. Due to this unprecedented medical hardship and our severe financial strain, we are requesting a complete waiver of the accrued delinquent interest and a 50% reduction of the principal balance on the outstanding loan. As a community-minded lender, we trust you will do the right thing for a sick elder and a retired manufacturing worker who has always paid his bills when able. We look forward to your prompt, compassionate response so we can focus on our father's recovery. Sincerely, Leo Vance, Chief Representative, the Vance family. Vivian held the warm clay bowl against her chest, her eyes scanning the lines of the letter. The metabolic calculator in her mind processed the sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of Leo's words. He was writing to a faceless corporate lender, pleading for compassion and respect for a sick elder. He was using his father's heart surgery, the very surgery Vivian had paid for, as a shield to beg for a $30,000 discount on a loan he had forged, stolen, and wasted on his own failed business ventures. He had spent the previous evening publicly defaming Vivian on Facebook, claiming she was a greedy, cold-hearted monster who had abandoned her family in their time of need. Yet, at the exact same time, he was secretly writing to her shell company, trying to use the tragedy to escape the debt he had illegally accumulated. He had no idea that the management of Vance Holdings was the very sister he had spent his life exploiting and mocking. He had no idea that the faceless corporate entity he was trying to manipulate was Vivian. She calculated the exact trajectory of her response. If she denied his request immediately, Leo would panic. He would realize the lender was unyielding, and he might start looking for other ways to move assets or try to borrow more money elsewhere before the foreclosure could hit. She wanted him calm. She wanted him to believe his clever little letter had bought them time. She opened a secure chat window with her real estate attorney, Richard. Vivian. Richard, I received Leo's request for principal reduction on the Oak Creek note through the Vance Holdings portal. Please instruct our administrative team to send our standard boilerplate response today. Richard, the 90-day administrative delay notice? Vivian, yes. Send the automated confirmation stating that his request has been received, is currently under formal legal and compliance review, and that a final determination will be issued to the homeowner on Monday, November 24th. Richard, Monday, November 24th. Understood. That aligns perfectly with the notice of default filing. Vivian, exactly. I want them to believe they are negotiating. I want them to think they have a chance. Let them enjoy their recovery, their lies, and their false sense of security for the next 11 days. Richard, I'm processing the template now, Vivian. It will be in his inbox within the hour. Vivian closed her laptop. She took another sip of her matcha, the warm, earthy liquid clearing the last of the morning's chill from her body. The L-theanine in the tea was working, leaving her mind sharp, quiet, and completely focused. She walked over to her large balcony windows, watching the sun rise over the city, turning the gray concrete and glass towers into a sea of bright golden light. Leo was sitting in his basement room at Oak Creek, or perhaps by his father's hospital bed, feeling incredibly clever. He had posted his heroic lie on Facebook, and now he believed he had successfully used his father's sickness to hustle a corporate bank. He had no idea that every single line he had typed, every single move he had made, was being documented, filed, and used to tighten the steel cord around his neck. She had spent her life being the silent victim of their greed. But now, she was the silent architect of their ruin, and the clock was ticking down to the exact second of their collapse. The thin, high-pitched ring of fine crystal vibrated through the quiet kitchen, a clean, crystalline note that lingered in the air for several seconds before slowly fading into the silence. Vivian stood at her sink, performing her Friday evening routine. She had just finished a quiet, solitary dinner of grilled sea bass and braised greens, and now she was washing her crystal wine glasses. They were handmade, delicate things, with stems as thin as pine needles and bowls so light they felt like frozen bubbles in her hands. She held a glass gently, dipping it into the warm, soapy water. She used a soft sponge, wiping the rim in a slow, rhythmic circle, ensuring no pressure was applied to the fragile bowl. If she squeezed even a fraction too hard, the crystal would shatter, slicing into her palm. She rinsed the glass under a thin stream of hot water, then held it up to the light, checking for any water spots or smudges. She wrapped a clean linen towel around her fingers and buffed the glass until it was completely transparent, flawless, and perfectly reflective under the pendant lights. This was her physical routine, a delicate, mindful process that required absolute presence. She enjoyed the fragility of the glass, the contrast between the hot water and the cool air, and the quiet satisfaction of putting things back in their proper, pristine order. She set the clean glass on a soft drying mat and picked up her phone to set it to her weekend Do Not Disturb mode. Before she could toggle the switch, a text message from Helen arrived. It was 8:12 p.m. Helen, Vivian, your father is being discharged tomorrow afternoon. The doctor says his vitals are perfect and he can continue his recovery at home. Since you were so busy with your corporate meetings this week and couldn't find the time to visit him or support us, we've decided as a family that it's best if we give you some space. Leo is taking care of everything now. He is working directly with the mortgage company to restructure our home loan, and he's handling your father's physical therapy schedule. We don't need you to worry about us anymore. We are going to handle things as a family from now on. Don't worry about visiting or calling. We'll let you know if we ever need anything. Vivian stood in the warm light of her kitchen, her finger resting on the cool edge of the screen. She ran an internal calculation. It was the classic narcissistic discard. Helen and Leo, basking in the public glory of their Facebook lies and believing they had successfully hustled the faceless bank, Vance Holdings, for a $30,000 principal reduction, had decided they no longer needed Vivian. Because Vivian had set a boundary, because she had refused to hand over her credit cards and had forced them to go through a trustee system, they were attempting to punish her. They were firing her before she could quit. They were using the language of exile, giving you some space, handling things as a family, fully believing that their silence would wound her, that she would panic at being excluded from the family circle, and that she would eventually crawl back, begging for forgiveness and offering her checkbook to buy her way back in. They thought they were holding all the cards. They thought their silence was a weapon. Vivian took a slow, deep breath. She felt no tightness in her chest. She felt no hot flush of anger. Instead, she felt a profound, beautiful sense of lightness, as if a heavy, wet wool coat had suddenly been lifted from her shoulders. By voluntarily severing the connection, by choosing to discard her, they had completely freed her. They had removed the last lingering shred of familial complexity from her upcoming actions. She didn't have to worry about the emotional fallout of blocking them. They had already told her, "Don't worry about calling." She didn't have to feel a single moment of hesitation about the foreclosure. They had proudly declared that Leo was taking care of everything now. They had walked themselves directly into the center of the trap, locked the door from the inside, and thrown the key out the window, all while smiling for their audience. She looked at her digital calendar. Today was Friday, November 14th. The Monday of the execution, November 24th, was exactly 10 days away. 10 days of silence. 10 days of Leo sitting on the porch at Oak Creek, feeling like a self-made businessman who had saved his father and beaten the bank. 10 days of Helen telling her church friends how blessed she was to have a real son. And then, the Monday morning sun would rise, and the steel teeth of her trap would snap shut. Vivian did not type a response. She did not argue. She did not defend her absence, and she did not wish them well. She simply tapped the toggle button on her phone, turning on her Do Not Disturb filter, silences sweeping over her screen like a dark, peaceful wave. She picked up the second crystal glass, dipping it into the warm, clean water, her fingers light and steady, listening to the quiet, rhythmic ping of the crystal as she buffed it dry, completely at peace in her silent tower. The steady, rhythmic flush, flush, flush of cool water was the only sound in the bathroom at 8 a.m. on Saturday. Vivian stood at her white ceramic sink, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Before her lay her small collection of vintage fountain pens, finely crafted instruments of black resin, sterling silver, and 18-karat gold. Once a month, she performed the quiet, meticulous routine of disassembling and cleaning them. She unscrewed the barrel of her favorite German piston filler pen, separating the delicate gold nib and feed from the body. She held the nib under the thin stream of water. Instantly, the dry, stubborn midnight blue ink began to dissolve, bleeding out into the white basin. It swirled and billowed like a dark, stormy cloud, twisting in the clean water before slipping silently down the brass drain. She flushed the internal chamber repeatedly, drawing clean water in and forcing it out until the stream ran completely clear. She laid the pieces on a soft, lint-free cloth, gently dabbing the gold feed until it was bone dry. This was her physical routine, a slow, silent task that required extreme precision. If she misaligned the gold tines or let the ink dry in the microscopic channels, the pen would never write smoothly again. It was a physical anchor, a reminder that the most delicate mechanisms required the most patient maintenance. She picked up her phone from the vanity to check her calendar. It was Saturday morning, the day her father was being discharged from St. Jude's. There were no text messages from Helen or Leo. True to their word, they had initiated their passive-aggressive silent treatment. They were punishing her by withholding their presence, fully expecting her to sit in her apartment, stewing in the guilt of her exile. But as Vivian opened her secure corporate portal for Vance Holdings LLC, she saw a new automated system alert. Leo had logged into the portal at 6:45 a.m. He had uploaded a supplementary letter to his existing principal reduction request. Vivian sat at her desk, her gold fountain pen pieces drying on the cloth beside her, and opened the PDF. Vance Holdings Underwriting Committee. I am writing to provide an update on Arthur Vance's status. My father is being discharged from St. Jude's County Hospital today, Saturday, November 15th. He is returning to his home at the Oak Creek property to begin his 2-week home recovery. We are deeply grateful for your automated confirmation that our hardship request is under formal legal review. We are fully prepared to sign the restructured principal reduction agreement on Monday, November 24th, as soon as your office releases the documents. This reduction is critical for our family. It will allow our father to focus on his healing without the heavy, suffocating stress of a greedy corporate entity breathing down our necks. As his primary caretaker, I want to thank you for showing the kind of compassion and understanding that we unfortunately could not find within our own family during this trial. We look forward to finalizing the paperwork on the 24th. Sincerely, Leo Vance, Chief Family Representative. Vivian leaned her head back against her leather chair, her eyes fixed on the glowing screen. A greedy corporate entity breathing down our necks. The compassion we could not find within our own family. The projection was absolute, a perfect psychological mirror of Leo's own internal decay. He was calling a corporate shell company compassionate because he believed he was successfully manipulation hustling them for a $30,000 discount, while calling his own sister greedy because she had refused to hand him a blank check. He had no idea that the compassionate entity he was praising was the exact same sister he was accusing of coldness. Vivian ran an internal calculation on the physical reality of the day. Right now, Leo was likely pulling his silver truck up to the St. Jude's discharge lobby. He would be holding his father's elbow, helping Arthur slowly settle into the passenger seat, acting like the perfect, dutiful son for the benefit of the passing nurses. Helen would be sitting in the back, holding a plastic bag of prescription bottles and cardiac recovery pamphlets, her eyes wet with the easy tears of a victim who had survived a storm. They were driving back to the Oak Creek house. They were going to carry Arthur up the front steps, lay him in his bed, and brew him a pot of cheap tea. They would sit in the living room, feeling the warm, cozy comfort of their survival, completely oblivious to the fact that the bed Arthur was sleeping in, the kitchen Helen was cooking in, and the very roof over their heads didn't belong to them. It belonged to Vance Holdings LLC. It belonged to Vivian. They were sleeping in her house, under her protection, while publicly declaring her a monster. A cold, unshakable calm settled over Vivian. She did not feel the urge to write a furious reply. She did not feel the need to expose her ownership of the company. She turned back to her vanity. She took her dry fountain pen, carefully reassembling the gold feed into the resin barrel. She opened a small, square bottle of deep midnight blue ink. She dipped the nib into the dark liquid, turning the piston to draw the fresh ink up into the chamber. She wiped the excess ink from the gold tines with a clean cloth, the gold shining brightly under the vanity lamp. She opened her leather-bound planner to the page for Monday, November 24th. Using her freshly inked pen, she wrote a single word across the top of the blank page, her handwriting clean, elegant, and perfectly structured. Clean. She closed the planner, the heavy paper settling with a soft, dry sigh. Let them have their weekend. Let Leo brag to the neighbors on the porch. Let Helen tell Aunt Linda how Leo's savings had saved Arthur's life. Let them bask in the absolute peak of their illusions for the next 9 days. Every smile they shared, every lie they told, and every breath they took under her roof was simply a debt they were accumulating. And on Monday morning, she was going to collect it down to the very last cent. At 8:55 a.m. on Monday, November 24th, a thin layer of early morning frost clung to the edges of the frosted glass windows of Vivian's high-rise office, turning the sprawling city below into a quiet, frozen canvas of silver and gray. Inside, the silence was heavy, absolute, and pristine. Vivian sat at her desk, her posture upright and effortless. Before her lay her daily physical routine of preparation. She opened her leather-bound planner to the page marked with the single, ink-written word, clean. Next to it, she placed her new phone, a sleek, dark titanium device with a brand-new, unlisted number that had been activated only an hour ago. She took a soft cloth, wiped a microscopic speck of dust from the screen, and set it down precisely parallel to the edge of her desk. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her warm water, enjoying the sharp, clean taste of the fresh lemon. Her breathing was slow, even, and perfectly controlled. At exactly 9 a.m., the corporate terminal on her desk chimed once. It was a single, low-frequency tone. An email from Richard had arrived. "Vivian, the filings are complete." At exactly 9 a.m., the notice of default and intent to foreclose on the Oak Creek property was officially registered with the county clerk. Vance Holdings, LLC is now the legal administrator of the foreclosure estate. Simultaneously, the state's attorney's office executed the arrest warrant for Leo Vance. The local sheriff's department, accompanied by our private process server, has just arrived at the Oak Creek residence to serve both the foreclosure papers and the warrant for grand larceny and bank fraud. The execution is complete. You are legally, financially, and structurally insulated. Best, Richard. Vivian stared at the screen. She did not smile. She did not feel a sudden, hot surge of triumph. The metabolic calculator in her mind simply recorded the final, clean closure of the ledger. 60 miles away, in the quiet, drafty living room of the Oak Creek house, the heavy, metallic knock of authority was currently shattering the morning silence. Arthur would be sitting in his favorite recliner, his chest healed, his new heart valve pumping strong, stable blood through his veins. Helen would be in the kitchen, pouring a cup of cheap tea, fully believing that their 2-week silence had successfully punished Vivian. Leo would be lounging on the sofa, still basking in the glow of his false heroism, waiting for the email from Vance Holdings confirming his $30,000 mortgage reduction. Instead, when Helen opened the door, she would find a sheriff's deputy holding a set of steel handcuffs and a process server holding a thick manila envelope stamped with the logo of Vance Holdings, LLC. They would learn that their son was not a hero, but a criminal facing years in a state penitentiary for forging his father's signature. They would learn that the very house they lived in, the roof they slept under, was being reclaimed by the faceless bank they had tried to hustle. And when Helen, hyperventilating and weeping, frantically grabbed her phone to call her daughter, to scream, to beg, to manipulate, she would hear only a flat, automated recording. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service. Please check the number and try again." When she tried to call the trust, she would be politely informed by a legal assistant that all communication must go through Vance Holdings' litigation team. When she tried to access the bank route where Vivian's money used to flow, she would find the bridge entirely dismantled, the concrete poured over, and the road erased. The gold tap was gone. The water had permanently run dry. They were left to the absolute, unyielding mercy of the law and the complete financial ruins of the son who had nothing. Vivian picked up her new phone. She opened her desk drawer, placed the silent device inside, and slid the drawer shut. The heavy wood clicked into place with a quiet, solid thud. She stood up, walked to her floor-to-ceiling windows, and looked out at the vast, bright horizon. The sun had finally broken through the frost, washing her office in a brilliant, clean, and unyielding light. Sometimes, the ultimate act of self-preservation is not a dramatic speech, a screaming confrontation, or a desperate plea for closure. Sometimes, it is simply the quiet, systematic withdrawal of your presence. It is a changed number, a locked bank route, a closed door. She had paid their debt. She had saved his life. But she had finally, permanently closed the ledger of her guilt. She was free. In the quiet chambers of our own homes, we lock our deepest secrets away, believing the heavy wood will keep them safe. But every debt must eventually be settled, and some sins are simply too heavy for family doors to hold. Thank you for walking this dark, quiet path of reckoning with us on Sins Behind Family Doors. If Vivian's silent, clinical victory and her unbreakable boundaries resonated with you, if you believe that self-preservation is the ultimate form of strength, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on her final, cold choice. By subscribing to Sins Behind Family Doors, you ensure you never miss our next high-stakes psychological drama, where the deepest secrets are brought to light and the quietest monsters are finally forced to pay their dues. Until next time, keep your boundaries strong, your silences absolute, and remember, not every door is meant to be opened again.